The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Ravencrest Palace as Prince Alexander paced frantically in his private study. His hands trembled as he clutched the letter that had arrived just hours earlier, the royal seal broken and its contents burning like acid in his mind. Princess Isabella, his beloved wife of 12 years, had made her decision. She was leaving the palace, leaving their life together, and, most devastatingly, she was taking their 2 young children with her. Alexander's breathing became labored as he read the carefully pinned words for the 100th time. Isabella wrote of feeling trapped, suffocated by the endless protocols and expectations that came with royal life. She spoke of wanting a normal existence for their children, away from the constant scrutiny of the press and the rigid formalities that governed every aspect of their daily routine. Most painfully, she mentioned feeling like a stranger in her own marriage, as if the crown had slowly erected walls between them that neither could tear down. The prince's composure, which had been his greatest strength throughout years of public service, finally cracked. He swept the contents of his mahogany desk onto the floor in a violent motion, sending crystal paperweights and leather-bound ledgers crashing. His anguished cry echoed through the ornate room, bouncing off oil paintings of his ancestors who seemed to watch him with disapproving eyes. This was not how royalty was supposed to behave. This was not the controlled, measured response expected of a future king. Outside in the corridor, servants froze mid-step as the sounds of destruction reached their ears. Footsteps hurried away as word spread quickly through the palace staff. Something terrible was happening in the prince's study, something that would change everything they thought they knew about their usually composed and dignified future monarch. Queen Mother Cordelia heard the commotion from 3 rooms away. As she made her way toward Alexander's study, a satisfied smile played at the corners of her mouth. She had been waiting for this moment for years, watching as Isabella's influence over her son grew stronger and more troublesome. The young princess had never quite fit the mold that Cordelia had envisioned for the future queen. Isabella was too independent, too willing to challenge tradition, too focused on modernizing the monarchy in ways that made the queen mother deeply uncomfortable. Cordelia paused outside Alexander's door, listening to the muffled sounds of her son's breakdown. Rather than feeling maternal concern, she felt vindicated. She had always believed that Isabella was weak, unsuited for the pressures of royal life. This dramatic departure proved her point perfectly. A true royal would never abandon their duties, no matter how difficult the personal cost. The Queen Mother's smile widened as she considered the opportunities this crisis would create. With Isabella gone, she could once again guide Alexander's decisions without interference. She could help him choose a more suitable wife, someone who understood that personal desires must always come second to duty and tradition, someone who would respect the established order instead of constantly questioning it. As she turned to leave, Cordelia caught sight of several servants huddled near the servants' staircase, whispering urgently among themselves. Their faces showed genuine concern for Prince Alexander, and she realized with irritation that many of the palace staff had grown fond of Princess Isabella over the years. The young woman had made a point of learning their names, asking about their families, and treating them with a warmth that Cordelia considered inappropriate familiarity. The Queen Mother made a mental note to address this later. The servants' loyalties needed to be properly managed during this transition. She couldn't have half the palace staff pining for Isabella's return or, worse yet, speaking sympathetically about her to the press. The narrative needed to be controlled carefully. Isabella would be portrayed as someone who couldn't handle the responsibilities of royal life, someone who chose selfish desires over duty to crown and country. Meanwhile, in his study, Alexander had collapsed into his leather chair, his head in his hands. The initial rage had given way to a crushing sense of loss and confusion. He tried to remember when things had started going wrong. There had been no single dramatic event, no major argument or betrayal. Instead, it had been a gradual erosion, like waves slowly wearing away at a cliff face. He thought about their early years together, when Isabella's laugh could fill an entire room, and her optimism about their future had been infectious. She had embraced royal life with enthusiasm, throwing herself into charitable work and public engagements with a genuine passion that had impressed even his most skeptical advisors. But, somewhere along the way, that enthusiasm had dimmed. The constant criticism from the press, the rigid protocols that governed everything from how she held her teacup to which charities she could support, the way every spontaneous gesture was analyzed, and often condemned as inappropriate. It had all taken its toll. Alexander realized with painful clarity that he had failed to protect her from the worst aspects of royal life. He had been so focused on fulfilling his own duties, on living up to expectations, that he hadn't noticed how isolated and unhappy Isabella had become. When she tried to talk to him about her struggles, he had offered practical solutions instead of emotional support. When she suggested changes to make royal life more bearable, he had explained why tradition couldn't be altered. He had chosen the crown over his wife without even realizing he was making that choice. The prince stood up slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. He needed to see his children before Isabella took them away. Prince Thomas, just 8 years old, and Princess Sophia, barely 6, had no idea their world was about to be turned upside down. Alexander's heart ached as he imagined trying to explain to them why Mommy was taking them to live somewhere else, why Daddy couldn't come with them. As he made his way through the palace corridors toward the nursery wing, Alexander became aware of the unusual silence that had fallen over the normally bustling palace. Servants stepped aside quickly as he passed, their eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and uncertainty. News of the crisis was clearly spreading, though he doubted anyone knew the full extent of what was happening. The palace had always been a place where secrets were currency, and gossip traveled faster than official announcements. By evening, every member of the staff would know that Princess Isabella was leaving. By tomorrow morning, the story would likely reach the ears of journalists who had contacts among the palace workers. Alexander knew he needed to prepare for the media storm that would follow, but, right now, all he could think about was the family that was slipping away from him. In the nursery, he found Isabella sitting on the floor with their children, helping them pack their favorite toys into small suitcases. The sight nearly brought him to his knees again. Thomas looked up with confusion in his bright blue eyes, so similar to Alexander's own. "Daddy, why is Mommy sad? Why are we packing?" Isabella met Alexander's gaze across the room, and, for a moment, her resolve seemed to waver. There was still love there, buried beneath layers of hurt and disappointment. But there was also a determination that he had never seen before, a strength born from desperation. She had made her choice, and nothing he could say would change her mind. The prince knelt down beside his children, struggling to find words that could possibly explain the inexplicable. How could he tell them that sometimes, even people who love each other very much can't find a way to stay together? How could he make them understand that their mother wasn't abandoning them, but trying to save them from a life she believed would crush their spirits the way it had crushed hers? As the afternoon sun began to fade, casting the nursery in golden twilight, the royal family sat together for what might be the last time. Outside, Queen Mother Cordelia was already making phone calls, beginning the delicate process of managing the crisis. The palace machinery was starting to turn, preparing statements and strategies to protect the monarchy from the scandal that was about to engulf them all. The black sedan pulled away from Ravencrest Palace just as the evening news was beginning across the kingdom. Inside the vehicle, Princess Isabella held her children close, their small faces pressed against the tinted windows as they watched their home disappear behind the ornate iron gates. Thomas had finally stopped asking questions, sensing that something momentous and irreversible was happening. Little Sophia clutched her stuffed unicorn, the same toy she had received for her 3rd birthday from her father, back when their family had seemed unbreakable. Isabella's heart pounded as they drove through the countryside toward her sister's estate, a modest manor house 2 hours from the capital. She had made this journey countless times over the years, but never under circumstances like these. Every mile that passed between her and Alexander felt like another door closing, another bridge burning. She knew there would be no easy path back from this decision. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from the palace press office, from Alexander's private secretary, from well-meaning friends who had somehow already heard rumors of her departure. She turned the device off and slipped it into her purse. For the first time in 12 years, she didn't want to know what the palace thought she should do or say. She was no longer bound by their carefully crafted protocols and responses. The children fell asleep during the drive, exhausted by the emotional upheaval of the day. Isabella watched their peaceful faces and felt a mixture of relief and terror wash over her. She had given them a chance at normalcy, but she had also torn them away from their father and everything they had ever known. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her like a physical force. Back at Ravencrest Palace, the evening had descended into barely controlled chaos. Alexander had locked himself in his study again, refusing to speak to anyone except the children's governess, whom he desperately questioned about Isabella's plans and state of mind. The poor woman, caught completely off guard by the day's events, could offer no insights beyond confirming that the princess had seemed determined but heartbroken. Queen Mother Cordelia had taken command of the crisis response with military precision. She sat in the palace's main conference room, surrounded by the kingdom's top communications experts, legal advisors, and security officials. The mahogany table was covered with draft statements, newspaper clippings, and tablets displaying social media feeds where speculation about the royal family was already beginning to swirl. The Queen Mother's primary concern was not her son's emotional well-being or her grandchildren's trauma, but rather the monarchy's reputation. She had lived through enough royal scandals to know that the first 48 hours would determine whether this crisis could be contained or whether it would spiral into a disaster that could damage the crown for generations. "We need to control the narrative immediately," she declared to the assembled team. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had navigated royal politics for over 4 decades. The princess chose to abandon her duties and her family. She was unable to cope with the responsibilities of royal life. This is not a failure of the monarchy or Prince Alexander. This is a personal failing on her part. The communications director, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Thornfield, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She had worked closely with Princess Isabella for years and knew the real story was far more complex. "Your Majesty, with respect, the public has been very fond of the princess. If we paint her as weak or selfish, it might backfire. Perhaps a more sympathetic approach." Cordelia's eyes flashed with irritation. "The public's fondness is precisely the problem, Margaret. They've been allowed to forget that being royal means sacrifice. Isabella's popularity was built on her relatability, her casualness, her modern approach. Those very qualities that made her popular also made her unsuitable for the role. Now we have an opportunity to remind everyone what true royal behavior looks like." The Queen Mother stood and moved to the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. The manicured lawns stretched out in geometric perfection, every hedge trimmed, every flower bed arranged with mathematical precision. This was how royalty should be, controlled, predictable, beautiful from a distance. Isabella had tried to bring spontaneity and authenticity to an institution that required neither. "I want a statement ready by tomorrow morning," Cordelia continued. "Something dignified but clear. The prince is committed to his duties and his people. He regrets that his wife was unable to share that commitment. The children will remain part of the royal family and will be raised with proper understanding of their roles and responsibilities." Several advisors exchanged glances. They all knew that last point was not guaranteed. Isabella still had parental rights, and the legal battle ahead would be complex and potentially very public. But Queen Mother Cordelia spoke as if her will alone could determine the outcome, and most of the staff had learned not to contradict her when she was in this mood. Dr. William Hartwell, the palace physician, cleared his throat nervously. He was one of the few people present who dared to challenge the Queen Mother's directives. "Your Majesty, I'm concerned about Prince Alexander's state of mind. Perhaps before we focus on public statements, we should consider getting him some support. This kind of emotional trauma can have serious consequences if not addressed properly." Cordelia turned from the window with a cold smile. "Alexander is stronger than you give him credit for, Doctor. He was raised to handle adversity with grace and dignity. A little heartbreak never killed anyone, and it might actually make him a better king. His father went through similar challenges, and look how well he turned out." The comparison stung because everyone in the room remembered the previous king's struggles with depression and alcohol following his own marital difficulties. But no one dared to mention this uncomfortable parallel. The Queen Mother had a way of rewriting history to suit her current needs, and challenging her version of events was a career-limiting move for most palace staff. Meanwhile, 3 floors above in the royal family's private apartments, Alexander sat alone in the dark. He had been there for hours, staring out at the grounds where he and Isabella used to walk with the children on Sunday mornings. Those had been the only times when they could be almost normal, when protocol relaxed enough to allow for impromptu games of tag or picking flowers from the cutting garden. He replayed every conversation from the past year, searching for signs he had missed, moments when he could have made different choices. There had been that evening in spring when Isabella had asked him why they never just talked anymore, why every conversation seemed to be about schedules and obligations. He had brushed off her concern, saying that their responsibilities naturally left little time for casual conversation. Now he realized she had been telling him something important, and he had completely failed to hear it. There was the charity gala where Isabella had suggested they support a controversial but worthy cause that helped homeless families. Alexander had explained why the royal family couldn't associate with anything that might be seen as taking political sides. The disappointment in her eyes had lasted for days, but he had convinced himself he was protecting her from criticism. In reality, he had been protecting the institution at the expense of her passion and idealism. Alexander's phone rang, displaying his brother Prince Frederick's number. Frederick lived in the kingdom's second city, managing regional royal duties and maintaining a much lower profile than the heir apparent. The two brothers had grown closer in recent years, partly because Frederick understood the pressures of royal life without carrying the ultimate burden of future kingship. "Alex, I just heard." Frederick's voice was filled with genuine concern. "How are you holding up?" For the first time all day, Alexander felt his carefully maintained composure crack again. "I don't know, Fred. I honestly don't know anything anymore. She's gone. She took the children. I don't even know where they are." "They're safe," Frederick said gently. "I made some calls. They're with Isabella's sister. The children are fine. And Isabella, well, she's protecting them the only way she knows how." Alexander felt a flash of anger. Protecting them from what? From me? From their own family? "From this," Frederick replied quietly. "From a life where their every move is scrutinized, where they can never make mistakes without national consequences, where their personal happiness always comes second to public duty. You know as well as I do what that's like, Alex. The difference is we were born into it. Isabella chose it, and now she's choosing something else." The truth of his brother's words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He had never questioned whether the life they lived was actually good for anyone involved. It was simply the life they had inherited, the responsibility they bore. But Isabella had shown him, through her leaving, that there were alternatives. People could choose happiness over duty. People could prioritize their children's emotional well-being over their public image. "What am I supposed to do now?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Frederick was quiet for a long moment. "You could go after her. You could choose her over the crown." The suggestion hung in the air like a dangerous secret. In all his years of royal training, no one had ever suggested that walking away was an option. The crown was not something you abandoned. It was something that chose you and held you for life. But Frederick's words planted a seed of possibility that Alexander had never allowed himself to consider. Before Alexander could respond, he heard voices in the corridor outside his room. Queen Mother Cordelia was speaking in low, urgent tones with someone, probably the communications team, still working on their damage control strategy. The sound of his mother's voice reminded him of all the reasons why leaving was impossible. The monarchy needed continuity. The people deserved stability. His duty was larger than his personal happiness. But, for the first time in his life, Prince Alexander wondered whether duty without love was worth preserving, and whether a crown that demanded such terrible sacrifices from the people who wore it deserved to survive at all. The morning newspapers arrived at Ravencrest Palace like harbingers of doom. Despite the communications team's best efforts to control the story, word of Princess Isabella's departure had leaked to 3 major publications simultaneously. The headlines screamed across newsstands throughout the kingdom. "Princess flees palace with children," and "Royal marriage in crisis" dominated the front pages, accompanied by file photos of Isabella looking radiant at public events, and Alexander appearing stern and distant. Queen Mother Cordelia stood in the palace's morning room. Newspapers spread across the antique breakfast table like battle plans. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't quite hide the exhaustion from a sleepless night spent managing the crisis, but her posture remained rigid with determination. She had faced media storms before, weathering scandals that had threatened to topple the monarchy entirely. This situation, while emotionally fraught, was ultimately manageable if handled with sufficient ruthlessness. What infuriated her most was not the coverage itself, but the tone. The articles portrayed Isabella sympathetically, quoting anonymous sources who described her as a devoted mother overwhelmed by royal pressures. One particularly damaging piece included interviews with former palace staff who spoke glowingly of the princess's kindness and genuine care for the common people. The narrative was shaping up to be one of a beautiful, caring woman crushed by an unforgiving system rather than a weak individual who had failed her duties. Cordelia's lips curved into what could generously be called a smile, though it held no warmth whatsoever. She had anticipated this sympathetic coverage, and she was prepared for it. The palace's vast network of media contacts, built up over decades, was already being activated. Favorable stories were being planted with friendly journalists, stories that would remind the public of the sacrifices required by royal life and the importance of duty over personal desires. The Queen Mother's personal secretary, a nervous young man named Christopher, entered the room with obvious reluctance. "Your Majesty, Prince Alexander is asking to see you. He seems quite agitated about the newspaper coverage." Cordelia waved a dismissive hand. "Tell him I'll speak with him after the morning briefing. Right now, managing this crisis takes precedence over managing his emotions." Christopher hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with delivering such a message to the grieving prince. "Your Majesty, with respect," he specifically mentioned wanting to issue his own statement. He seems to feel that the palace's approach is too harsh toward the princess. This got Cordelia's attention immediately. The last thing she needed was Alexander undermining the carefully crafted narrative with some emotional plea for understanding or, worse yet, an admission that the royal family bore responsibility for Isabella's departure. She had seen too many royal crises escalate when family members went off-message during moments of emotional vulnerability. "Very well," she said curtly. "Send him in. But make sure we're not disturbed." Alexander arrived within minutes, looking haggard and disheveled in a way that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. His usually perfect hair was unkempt, his clothes wrinkled, and his eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep. Most telling of all, he hadn't shaved, giving him a desperate, almost wild appearance that made Cordelia's disapproval deepen. "Mother, we need to change our approach," Alexander began without preamble. "The statements being prepared are too harsh. They make Isabella look like a villain when she's just a woman who couldn't cope with an impossible situation. The public will see through it, and it will make us look cruel and out of touch." Cordelia studied her son with calculating eyes. She had seen him upset before, but never quite like this. The combination of grief and guilt had stripped away his usual diplomatic polish, revealing a raw emotion that made him seem younger and more vulnerable than she had seen him in years. It also made him dangerous to her larger strategy. "Alexander," she said in the patient tone one might use with a confused child, "I understand you're hurting. But your personal feelings cannot be allowed to compromise the monarchy's position. Isabella made a choice to abandon her duties. If we don't address that clearly and firmly, we send the message that royal obligations are optional, that people can simply walk away when things become difficult." Alexander's jaw tightened. "She didn't abandon anything. We failed her. I failed her. The system we represent failed her. Don't you think the public deserves to know that we're capable of taking responsibility for our mistakes?" "The public deserves stability and continuity," Cordelia replied sharply. "They don't need to hear their future king admitting weakness or questioning institutions that have served this kingdom for centuries. Your role is to embody strength and certainty, not to engage in public self-flagellation." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Alexander growing increasingly frustrated and Cordelia becoming more entrenched in her position. What neither of them realized was that their raised voices were carrying beyond the soundproofed morning room. A serving maid named Helen, who had been cleaning the adjacent library, overheard fragments of their argument through the ventilation system. Helen had worked at the palace for 15 years and had always been fond of Princess Isabella, who remembered her name and asked about her children's progress in school. The maid's loyalties were torn between her employment obligations and her genuine affection for the departed princess. As she listened to Queen Mother Cordelia's cold dismissal of Isabella's struggles and her plans to paint the princess as weak and selfish, Helen's sympathies crystallized entirely. By lunchtime, Helen had shared what she had heard with 3 other trusted staff members. By evening, the information had reached Marcus Webb, a persistent tabloid journalist who had been cultivating palace contacts for over a decade. Webb had always been particularly interested in the tensions between the traditional and modern approaches to royalty, and this story offered him a perfect example of those conflicts playing out in real time. Meanwhile, at her sister's estate, Isabella was struggling with her own crisis of confidence. The weight of her decision had grown heavier with each passing hour, especially as news coverage painted her as either a victim or a villain, depending on the publication's editorial stance. She had hoped to shield her children from the media storm, but Thomas had already seen one of the headlines on a tablet left carelessly open by her sister's housekeeper. "Mommy, why do the newspapers say you ran away?" Thomas asked during lunch, his 8-year-old face creased with worry. "Did you do something bad?" Isabella's heart broke a little more. She knelt down to her son's level, searching for words that could explain the inexplicable. "Sometimes adults have to make very difficult choices, sweetheart. I chose to bring you somewhere you could be children without worrying about cameras or protocols or being perfect all the time. It's not about being good or bad. It's about what's best for our family." But even as she spoke the words, Isabella wondered if she had made the right choice. The cottage felt cramped after the vast spaces of the palace. The children missed their father terribly, asking for him constantly throughout the day. Most painful of all, she could see her own uncertainty reflected in their confused expressions. Children needed stability and predictability, and she had torn apart the only life they had ever known. Her sister Elena found her crying quietly in the garden that evening, after the children had finally fallen asleep. Elena, 5 years older and fiercely protective, had supported Isabella's decision from the moment she called asking for sanctuary. But seeing her sister's pain made Elena question whether escape was really the answer. "You could go back," Elena said gently. "Alexander loves you. The children love him. Maybe you could find a way to make it work, to change things from the inside." Isabella wiped her tears and shook her head. "I tried that for 12 years, Elena. Every time I suggested modernizing traditions or making royal life more family-friendly, I was told why it was impossible. Every time I wanted to take a stand on an issue I cared about, I was reminded that royals must remain neutral. I was slowly disappearing, becoming just a pretty figurehead who smiled and waved on command. But the children deserve better than watching their parents live a lie," Isabella said firmly. "They deserve to see that people can choose happiness, that duty doesn't have to mean sacrificing everything you are. If I stayed, what kind of example would I be setting? That women should accept being silenced? That love means nothing compared to tradition." Back at Ravencrest Palace, Alexander had finally given up trying to reason with his mother and had retreated to his children's empty nursery. Surrounded by their toys and artwork, he felt the full weight of what he had lost. The room still smelled faintly of Isabella's perfume and the children's bubble bath, familiar scents that now seemed to mock him with their hominess. He picked up Sophia's favorite bedtime story, a well-worn book about a brave princess who saved her kingdom through kindness rather than warfare. Isabella had read it to their daughter countless times, often adding her own commentary about how real strength came from compassion and understanding others. Now Alexander wondered if those bedtime stories had been Isabella's way of teaching their children values that the palace would never endorse. His private secretary knocked softly and entered with obvious reluctance. "Your Highness, there's been a development. A tabloid is preparing to run a story claiming that Queen Mother Cordelia has been actively working to discredit the princess. They seem to have inside information about palace meetings." Alexander felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. If Cordelia's machinations became public knowledge, it would transform the narrative from a sad marital breakdown into a story about palace intrigue and callous manipulation. The monarchy couldn't survive that kind of scrutiny, especially not when public sympathy was already leaning toward Isabella. "How long do we have?" Alexander asked. "The story runs tomorrow morning. The journalist called for comment an hour ago." Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the last vestiges of his controlled royal composure finally crumble completely. The crisis was spiraling beyond anyone's control, and he was powerless to stop it. In trying to protect the monarchy, his mother had instead created a scandal that threatened to destroy everything they claimed to represent. Tomorrow, the entire kingdom would wake up to headlines that would change everything, and Alexander still had no idea how to fix what had been broken or whether it was even possible to repair the damage that had been done to everyone he loved most. The explosive headline hit newsstands at dawn like a bomb detonating across the kingdom. Queen Mother's cruel plot. Palace insider reveals campaign to destroy beloved princess. Marcus Webb's article detailed not just the content of the private meeting between Queen Mother Cordelia and her advisors, but also her calculated strategy to paint Princess Isabella as weak and unsuitable for royal life. Direct quotes attributed to palace sources made Cordelia's cold dismissal of her daughter-in-law's struggles sound even more heartless than the reality. The public reaction was swift and devastating. Social media exploded with outrage directed not at Isabella, but at the royal establishment that had apparently driven her away through manipulation and emotional cruelty. Protest groups formed outside Ravencrest Palace gates within hours, carrying signs that read "Support Princess Isabella" and "Royal family equals heartless family." The monarchy's carefully maintained image of dignified service was crumbling in real time. Queen Mother Cordelia's breakfast was interrupted by an emergency call from the Prime Minister himself, Lord Harrison Blackwood, whose government stability was closely tied to public support for the crown. His voice carried barely controlled panic as he described the political crisis now engulfing the nation. Your Majesty, the opposition party is calling for a parliamentary inquiry into the royal family's treatment of Princess Isabella, Lord Blackwood explained tersely. Public opinion polls show approval for the monarchy has dropped 15 percentage points overnight. This is approaching constitutional crisis territory. Cordelia gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles white with tension. She had weathered many storms, but never one that had turned public sentiment so completely against the royal family itself. The carefully orchestrated narrative had backfired spectacularly, making her appear as the villain in a story that was supposed to protect the monarchy's reputation. How exactly did this information leak? She demanded, though she already suspected the answer. Palace sources suggest it came from someone who overheard your strategy meeting. Your Majesty, with respect, we need damage control immediately. The royal family needs to show unity and compassion, not division and calculation. After ending the call, Cordelia sat in her private sitting room, surrounded by decades of royal memorabilia and family portraits that now seemed to mock her predicament. She had spent her entire adult life protecting and preserving the monarchy, sacrificing personal relationships and individual happiness for the greater good of the institution. Now that very institution was under threat because of her actions. The irony was bitter. In trying to save the crown from Isabella's influence, she had instead created a crisis that could end the monarchy entirely. Public sentiment was turning against everything Cordelia held sacred, and she was being portrayed as the embodiment of everything wrong with royal tradition, cold, manipulative, and completely out of touch with modern values. Alexander found his mother in her sitting room an hour later, staring blankly at a portrait of his late father. The Queen Mother, who had always seemed invincible, now looked every one of her 72 years, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of public condemnation. I suppose you've come to tell me how right you were, Cordelia said without turning around. How I should have listened to your concerns about the palace's response. Alexander sat down across from her, studying the woman who had shaped his entire understanding of duty and responsibility. For the first time, he saw her not as an intimidating authority figure, but as someone who had been trapped by the same system that had constrained Isabella. No, Mother. I came to tell you that I understand why you did it. You were trying to protect something you've devoted your life to preserving. The tragedy is that in trying to save the monarchy from change, you've created a situation that might destroy it entirely. Cordelia finally looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Everything I've done, every sacrifice I've made, has been for this family and this institution. I watched your father struggle with the pressures of kingship, saw how it nearly broke him. I wanted to make sure you were stronger, that you understood the crown must come first. But perhaps, she trailed off, unable to finish the thought that challenged everything she had believed for decades. Perhaps the crown isn't worth keeping if it requires destroying the people who wear it, Alexander completed gently. Meanwhile, Isabella was facing her own reckoning at her sister's estate. The morning newspapers had been delivered despite Elena's efforts to keep them away, and Thomas had seen his grandmother's photograph on the front page alongside headlines describing her as cruel and manipulative. The 8-year-old was confused and upset, unable to understand why his beloved grandmama Cordelia was being called terrible names. Did grandmama really say mean things about you, Mommy? Thomas asked, his lower lip trembling. The newspaper says she wanted everyone to think you were bad. Isabella felt a crushing weight of guilt settle on her chest. In leaving the palace, she had wanted to protect her children from the pressures of royal life. Instead, she had exposed them to a public battle that was far more traumatic than anything they would have faced within palace walls. Her desire for freedom had inadvertently created a situation where her children's family relationships were being dissected and judged by millions of strangers. Little Sophia, too young to fully understand the newspaper articles, sensed the adult's distress and began crying for her father. I want to go home, she sobbed. I want Daddy. I want my room. Elena found Isabella that afternoon, sitting by the window with tears streaming down her face as she watched her children play in the garden. They looked so small and vulnerable, far removed from the protection and privilege they had known all their lives. They need stability, Isabella said quietly. They need their father, their home, their normal routine. What kind of mother am I if I keep them from all of that because of my own inability to cope? You're a mother who wanted to give them choices, Elena replied. But Maybe the choice doesn't have to be all or nothing. Maybe there's a middle ground. That evening, Isabella made the most difficult phone call of her life. Alexander answered on the first ring, his voice immediately filled with desperate hope when he heard her voice. "Isabella, are you all right? Are the children safe?" "We're all fine," she said, though her voice betrayed her emotional exhaustion. "Alex, I've been thinking. This public battle isn't what I wanted. The children are suffering, and I never intended for your mother to be vilified like this. Whatever our problems, she doesn't deserve to be portrayed as a monster." Alexander felt a surge of love for this woman who, even in her pain, could show compassion for someone who had tried to destroy her reputation. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe we need to talk. Really talk, not about duty or tradition or what's expected of us, but about what we actually want our lives to look like. About whether there's a way to be royal and still be human." "I'd like that very much," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "But, Isabella, you should know that I've been doing a lot of thinking too. About whether the crown is worth keeping if it costs us everything else that matters." The conversation continued for over an hour, both of them speaking more honestly than they had in years. They talked about the children's needs, about the possibility of reforming royal protocols, about whether the monarchy could evolve to accommodate modern values of family and personal happiness. By the time they hung up, they had agreed to meet the following day, not as prince and a strange princess, but as two people who had once loved each other deeply and might still be able to find a way forward together. Back at Ravencrest Palace, news of the planned reconciliation meeting spread quickly through the staff. The palace, which had been shrouded in gloom and tension for days, suddenly buzzed with cautious optimism. Even Queen Mother Cordelia, humbled by the public backlash against her machinations, seemed to soften slightly at the prospect of her grandchildren returning home. But, as Alexander prepared for what might be the most important conversation of his life, he knew that simply bringing Isabella back to the palace wouldn't solve their fundamental problems. The crisis had exposed deep flaws in the royal system that couldn't be ignored or smoothed over with traditional solutions. The monarchy itself was at a crossroads, forced to choose between preserving centuries of tradition and evolving to meet the needs of modern families and contemporary values. Alexander realized that his conversation with Isabella the next day wouldn't just determine the fate of their marriage. It would decide whether the crown could transform itself enough to survive in a world that was rapidly leaving its rigid traditions behind. The ancient oak tree in Willowbrook Park had witnessed countless secrets over its 300-year lifespan, but none quite like the one unfolding beneath its branches on this crisp autumn morning. Prince Alexander arrived first, having walked the 2 miles from where his security detail had dropped him at the park's entrance. He chose a simple wooden bench facing the lake, the same spot where he and Isabella had brought the children for picnics during happier times, when they could still pretend to be a normal family enjoying weekend outings. Isabella approached 15 minutes later, her footsteps soft on the fallen leaves. She looked different somehow, not diminished, as he had expected, but rather more herself than she had appeared in years. Without the constraints of royal protocol dictating her posture, clothing choices, and even facial expressions, she moved with a natural grace that reminded Alexander why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. They sat in silence for several minutes, both struggling to find words for a conversation that would determine not just their personal future, but potentially the direction of the monarchy itself. The morning mist rose from the lake, creating a dreamlike atmosphere that seemed to suspend them outside the normal rules of their constrained world. "I never wanted it to become so public," Isabella said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The children are asking questions I don't know how to answer. Thomas keeps asking if Grandmama Cordelia really hates us." Alexander winced. The media storm had painted his mother as a calculating villain, and, while her actions had been misguided, the portrait was harsher than she deserved. "She doesn't hate anyone. She's terrified. The monarchy has been her entire life's work, and she saw you as a threat to its stability. She was wrong, but her motives came from fear, not malice." "I know," Isabella replied softly, "and that's part of what makes this so tragic. We're all trapped in a system that pits love against duty, personal happiness against institutional preservation. Your mother felt she had to choose between protecting the crown and protecting me. You felt you had to choose between supporting your wife and fulfilling your royal obligations. I felt I had to choose between my sanity and my family." Alexander turned to face her fully, drinking in the sight of her face without the careful makeup and styled hair that palace life demanded. What if those choices are false ones? What if there's a way to be royal that doesn't require sacrificing everything human about ourselves? Isabella's eyes widened slightly. This was not the conversation she had expected. Throughout their marriage, Alexander had been the one defending tradition, explaining why change was impossible, insisting that duty must come before personal desires. To hear him questioning the fundamental assumptions of royal life was startling. "What are you saying, Alex?" Alexander took her hands in his, feeling how much he had missed this simple physical connection. "I'm saying that maybe the crown needs to evolve or risk becoming irrelevant. The public reaction to this crisis has shown me something important. People don't want perfect, untouchable royals anymore. They want authentic human beings who happen to serve in ceremonial roles." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing with words that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. "I've been thinking about my brother Frederick. He's managed to maintain his royal status while living a relatively normal life. He married for love, raises his children outside the public eye, and still fulfills his ceremonial duties. The key difference is that he's not the heir apparent." Isabella felt her heart skip. "Alexander, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe being king isn't worth losing everything else that matters to me. The Constitution allows for abdication. My brother could inherit the throne, and we could build the life we actually want instead of the one tradition demands." The words hung in the air like a revelation. Isabella had never allowed herself to imagine such a possibility. Abdication was associated with scandal and failure in royal history, but Alexander was framing it as a choice toward authenticity and happiness. "But your mother, your training, everything you've been prepared for since birth, would all be meaningless if I lost you and the children permanently," Alexander said firmly. "I've been so focused on preserving an institution that I forgot institutions are supposed to serve people, not the other way around." Isabella felt tears welling up in her eyes. This was the man she had fallen in love with, someone capable of growth, of putting family before protocol, of imagining new possibilities instead of accepting inherited limitations. But the magnitude of what he was suggesting was overwhelming. "Alex, that's an enormous decision. You can't make it just for me. The kingdom, your family's legacy, the stability of the monarchy." "The monarchy will survive," Alexander said with surprising confidence. "Frederick is well respected and fully trained in royal duties. He might actually be better suited for the role than I am. He's never struggled with the contradictions between personal happiness and royal obligation the way I have." They talked for 3 hours, covering everything from practical concerns about their children's future to the broader implications for the royal family. Alexander had clearly given this possibility serious thought, considering legal precedents, constitutional requirements, and potential public reactions. As the sun climbed higher, warming the autumn air, they began to envision a different kind of life. Alexander could retain some minor royal duties while pursuing meaningful work in environmental conservation, his longtime passion that had been relegated to ceremonial ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Isabella could raise their children with normal privacy expectations while still supporting charitable causes she cared about deeply. The children could attend regular schools, Isabella said, her excitement growing. They could have friends without security clearance, participate in activities without media coverage, make mistakes without national consequences. They could choose their own paths, Alexander agreed. If they want to serve the crown when they're older, that choice would be theirs to make as adults, not something forced on them by birth order. By noon, they had reached a tentative decision that would shock the world. Alexander would formally request permission to abdicate his position as heir apparent, allowing his brother to assume the succession while he and Isabella built a private life focused on family and personal fulfillment. The walk back to Isabella's sister's estate felt like a journey into a completely new future. Alexander called his security detail to pick him up from there, explaining that he would be staying for dinner and needed time with his children. The simple act of changing his schedule without consulting a dozen advisors felt revolutionary. Thomas and Sophia's joy at seeing their father was heartbreaking in its intensity. They clung to him with desperate affection, as if afraid he might disappear again. Alexander spent the afternoon playing simple games with them, reading stories, and answering their questions about when they could all be together again with honest optimism for the first time in weeks. That evening, as the children slept peacefully in their temporary beds, Alexander and Isabella sat together planning the most difficult conversation of their lives, the one they would need to have with Queen Mother Cordelia. She would be devastated by Alexander's decision to abdicate, viewing it as a betrayal of everything she had worked to preserve. But they also knew that trying to force their marriage back into the old patterns would only lead to another crisis down the road. The next morning's headlines would announce their reconciliation, but the public had no idea that behind the scenes, they were preparing to transform not just their own lives, but the future of the monarchy itself. Alexander's abdication would send shockwaves through the establishment, but it would also signal to the world that the royal family was capable of choosing humanity over tradition when necessary. As they fell asleep that night, for the first time in the same house in over a week, both Isabella and Alexander felt something they had almost forgotten existed: hope. Not for a return to their previous life, but for the possibility of building something entirely new. A love story that chose personal authenticity over public expectation, and a royal family that prioritized the well-being of its members over the preservation of outdated traditions. The crisis that had threatened to destroy their family had instead become the catalyst for the most significant change in royal protocol in generations, proving that sometimes the greatest act of service to an institution is having the courage to transform it completely.